You might have heard some things about transgender people. I want to help you understand who we are and how you can support us. I'm Celeste, and this is Celestial Navigation. For quick context, this is part 3 of a series reviewing Dr. Preston Sprinkle's interview with Dr. Paul Eddy about detransition. Billie Hoard joins me again as we discuss their continual dismissal of relevant studies. With that, we begin with Dr. Preston Sprinkle.
Yeah.
Methodology of the studies.
Okay, so a big section of my paper looked at studies from 1960 to 1922. That was my window. So 6 plus
2022.
2022. Yeah. And interestingly, so it's important to know that I think we tend to think that gender transition is a pretty new thing, but in fact it's not that new. In fact, I was surprised to find an ancient Assyriologist did an essay a few years ago showing that back in like the ancient Near East, there's at least 4 different gender rituals that Assyrians were using to transition genders.
Wow.
So I mean, this idea goes way back. We know there's one of the 3rd century Roman emperors who tried to transition to a female and had his physicians surgically create a vagina for it. So I mean, this has been a human thing, right?
Is that elegant?
Yes, exactly.
He used to hang out at brothels and have sex with men, or he would like learn how to have sex as a woman with other men. He would watch other women. Don't quote me on this. It's not something.
It's Elagabalus, and Preston is trying to poison the well, right? Like, yes. You didn't need to say that about him. It's true. Like, right. Elagabalus was not a great emperor by any stretch of the imagination. But the point was raised only that, like, something like gender transition has existed for centuries, for millennia. Valid, interesting point, right?
It's a good point that a lot of anti-trans people do hot.
Right. Yeah, this is also true, right? They want to say, like, it's a new thing, right? Which is also, I think, why you have a little bit of like from Sprinkle there for a second. But anyway, right. It's really fascinating to me that, like, he had to jump on, like, I'm going to poison that well. I need to make my listeners, the viewers, experience Elagabalus in a negative way, rather than a just kind of neutral, like, point of reference fact of somebody who did something gender transition-y, which absolutely that emperor did.
And yeah, the going after he did a sexual thing, right? It is that, like, trying to make it weird or something.
Yep.
When it's like, yeah, if you're a trans woman, then you're a woman, and lots of women have sex, and they do it as women. Then that's not a surprising conclusion. And the fact that the emperor was having sex at brothels, I don't think is terribly shocking.
Right. He's sexualizing us, honestly. Like, he's associating us with, like, weird-ish sexual practices, certainly sexual practices that his audience is going to receive as deviant and bad. And he doesn't need to. It's not relevant to the point that's being made. So why is he making it, is the question.
Yeah, Julia Serrano would have a lot to say.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that, where he wanted to learn how to have sex with a man as a woman, and he would go to brothels and learn something like that.
Just a study of Roman emperors is a sexological minefield, isn't it?
It is. Suetonius is still, oh my gosh, it's I know.
Nero had his anyway. Yeah. That's another podcast.
Okay, so yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, so the studies from I'm looking at your table of contents. You spend about 50 pages surveying all these key studies all the way up to the present day. I would imagine the more present day ones are the more significant ones, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
But so important to know that the first surgical gender transitions are already happening in 1931. All right. That was kind of a major year. And by the 50s, we're talking now, not much in the US. In fact, the US is not till the 60s, but in Europe, in Mexico, interestingly, in Casablanca, Morocco, there are a good number of these things happening in the 1950s, which means in the 1950s, people performing transitions began to have some of their clients come back to them and say, this did not go well. In fact, I'm regretting this. Right. So detransition reports start happening by the late 50s, at least. By the 1960s.
Just noting, he just did a quick equivocation. He said people were coming back saying this didn't go well. I don't like this. And therefore detransition. Those two things aren't the same, right? Like, you can say this surgery didn't go well. The results aren't what I wanted them to be. because what he's referencing are predominantly SRS procedures performed in Morocco, usually vaginoplasties. Right. And to say that like my vagina now does not operate in the way that I anticipated that it would, there is pain, the surgery has not gone well, it's a relatively new technology. They're not, like that is not saying I wish I still had a penis because actually I think I'm a man, right? Like that's not detransition. That is saying this surgery didn't work well. And and again, and this is funny because to him, this distinction matters a lot. He focuses on it a lot. And so for him to actually be eliding those two things here is shifty.
It's becoming enough of an issue that researchers who are trying to do longitudinal analysis of, so how does this go for people once they do, are starting to record, well, for some people it doesn't go so well. In fact, some want to reverse this already in the 1960s. So it's surprising to me.
Also, like, my background is in computer science, and I've taken, logic classes and things like that. Like, the phrase "some people want this" like logically means at least one person wanted this. And so like if you tell me people in the 50s started doing anything, right? Name a thing people started doing in the 50s. I am completely unsurprised by the idea that after some amount of time, some of those people who did those things are going to say, I wish I hadn't done that thing. You take lawn darts, or I don't know what the fashion was in the 50s or whatever. Certainly my parents have strong feelings about the fashions they wore in the 60s and 70s. But did they have fun at the time? Probably. But either way, like the fact that somebody does something and then eventually some people regret that thing. The question is how many, right? Yep. If you said, wow, 95% of those people who got transgender surgeries in the 50s and 60s eventually said, I really wish I had never done that. Yeah. That would be a huge deal. Because then we would say, wow, this is not going well. This is a lot of people thinking this is going to help them, and then it doesn't. So let's pump the brakes here.
It's how many and for what reason, right? Like, because the conclusion might be like, we actually just need to improve. We need to get better at this. Like, we need to invest more in how to do a proper vaginoplasty. It is not necessarily, and therefore we need to stop doing these.
A little research is being done when this is a phenomenon we've known about and have record of for over 6 decades, right? That's something we need to account for. Jump ahead, and decade after decade, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you continue to have in transition outcome reports, I would say a significant, now not the majority of people in almost every study I've ever seen have said they were glad they did transition, but
just he says it almost as an aside. Where it's like, look at the title of this video, right? Yeah. What do we actually know? Like, you're a fan of the phrase saying something with your whole chest, right? Yeah. He's almost taking the words back as he's saying that. Well, yeah, I guess the majority of, most studies I've seen, the majority of people are happy that they transition. But, like
so much for Sprinkle's 50% anecdotal conclusion at the beginning of the episode, right?
A statistically significant number of people also report things like this. I had real difficulties. Not saying how I regret it, but I had real difficulties. Or,
okay, literally just said, I don't regret it, but I have difficulties. I just had facial feminization surgery. I was under general anesthesia for 7 hours. They broke multiple bones in my face intentionally and skillfully. I have incisions and scars and healing, and my jaw is sore and my chin is numb, and all these sorts of things, all of which were an expected part of the surgery, all of which went great, and I am thrilled. And if you asked me, were there things that were uncomfortable about your surgery? Yeah, there definitely were. Are you happy that you have a scar on the top of your forehead from the incision? I don't love it, right? But would you do the surgery again? Yes, 11 times out of 10. Right? Like 100%, right? Like,
absolutely.
Life is trade-offs, right? Life is making choices. Very few things don't have trade-offs. And in fact, the fact that so many trans people are happy with their choices to do all these things, despite some of the things that I just said about my surgery, right? Despite how hard it was, despite, the social environment right now and people hating trans people or whatever. The fact that I do that despite that should tell you just how happy I am with having done it. Right.
This raises 2 points that I think are really important, right? One is it's interesting, Dr. Eddy talked about getting into we need to read the limitation section paper. We also need to read the methodology section of a paper, right? So if you have a paper that says, hey, there's a bunch of regrets surrounding this issue, right? This transition, right? Well, look at what questions they asked, right? Because if they ask you, was there a lot of pain involved in facial feminization surgery? You might say yes. And if they go away and conclude that you are a person who counts in the regrets box on the basis of saying there was a lot of pain, that's a problem. I think that maybe the slightly more realistic example would be, do you regret infertility as a result of going on HRT, right? And if the person's yeah, I wish I could have maintained fertility, you need to follow that up with do you wish it so much that you would not have transitioned now, or that you would advise your former self not to have transitioned? Because if they don't ask that question, they don't know the answer to that question. All they know is that the person wishes that infertility were not a side effect. And that's where you really do want to dig into the methodology of these papers.
Or not only do I regret it, but I regret it enough that I want you to do everything you can to surgically reverse this for me. Those tend to be the three kind of domains of what I do call in the paper, negative transition experiences. And because researchers don't usually tease those three out, they get glommed together, and it doesn't go well for assessing things. So what I did when I went through the studies, I had those categories in mind, which actually were proposed just in 2020 by a researcher. We got to separate these things. And I tried to do an analysis of those three different types of negative experiences. And what you have today, when most people talk about regret and detransition, is you hear these same statistics over and over. You hear, well, it's 1% to 2%.
Yeah,
that's just the common thing. Why do they say that? Here's why. Because in 1992 and 1993, a researcher named Paflin, in one article alone and another with a colleague in 92 and 93, did a very, very good study of a number of decades of reports on people who had transitioned. And they, in this 1992 study, said they found between 1 to 1.5% of people expressed regret.
Okay.
That's where we get that statistic. It's a 1992 study.
That's just not true. And he's going to go on to actually prove that it's not true. But he's making this claim that number has been just carried forward for 30 years now without anybody verifying it or anything. The U.S. transgender survey that just came out verified it again. The CAS review, which was anti-trans, found that it was less than 1% of people were detransitioning, right? This is a well-validated number, and recently. This is not a 30-year-old number.
Are you saying, Celeste, that it's not 20, 30, 40, 50% of people detransition? Because Winkle has some anecdotal data that he's concluding here.
I am saying that. Yes, I am in fact saying that.
Now, I think there's real problems with the fact that you're continuing to hear that stat 30 years later. Here's just one.
There absolutely would be problems with hearing that stat 30 years later if that was the only source of that stat. If that was the only source, especially given the DSM is different, the treatments are different, absolutely. If that was the only source of that stat, I would be here hey, we need to get out there and study this, right? But it's not. He's just wrong that people are quoting that particular study. I really don't know what he's talking about.
One reason. Back in those days, the only people who were able to transition were people who had gone through serious psychological examinations, at least 6 to a year month social transition first. This was not an informed consent based thing like it's happening today. This was, you had to pass a battery of things before anyone would ever consider operating on you. That's no longer the case today. We're increasingly moving to more lax standards and informed consent model. We're comparing apples and oranges.
I had a study pulled up here. So this is
which is why the current informed consent model isn't based on that study from the early 90s, and why it's relevant that modern studies of the U.S. transgender survey and whatever continue to show incredibly low things. And that's exactly why we have moved to an informed consent model, is we found that trans people are pretty good at knowing that they're trans.
Gosh, yeah. I mean, sometimes we have to do a thing on the history of gatekeeping in the medical community.
Right. Because trans people have been gatekept over and over and over. But informed consent applies to HRT. Informed consent, at least through my insurance, does not apply to gender affirming surgeries. I do have to have a therapist actually say, yes, you are of sound mind and you do have we do diagnose you with gender dysphoria, and we do agree that this will likely help you and things like that. And that is a whole process, right? The gender dysphoria diagnosis alone is 2 separate sessions with a gender therapist, and then I have to get referrals, and then I have to whatever, and I have to read you that gender dysphoria diagnosis once a year, right? And keep it up to date. And so there's still lots of gatekeeping. So I just think it's inaccurate for him to be like, oh yeah, we've just thrown the floodgates open.
Yeah. Informed consent exists in some states and it does not exist in other states. It exists in some parts of some states and doesn't exist in other parts of those states, right? Like how far can you actually travel to get it? And it is pretty much just HRT because of the way, like unless you are independently wealthy, if you need insurance to cover your processes, there is not informed consent because you need those 2 letters. Like you just, for insurance companies will not cover a surgery unless you get the 2 letters. It just won't.
Right.
So we don't functionally have informed consent for what they are actually talking about here.
Yeah, and I was going to say the informed consent model that they're saying, that does not apply to minors anywhere, as far as I know, for even HRT.
Friedman, I can't pronounce that last name.
Friedman Paflin.
Paflin. Gosh, there's a lot of consonants in that. You said it sounds good. Astrid Jung.
Jung.
Okay, Astrid. So makes me think of an Office episode. Anyway, I know one of the things that comes up in other studies methodologically is they don't say they survey 100 people. Like pre-transition 100 people, and then they might then they kind of follow up, but a lot of times there's a lot of people lost in the follow-up, so they might only have 52 that they follow up with, and 50 are happy to regret, but it's like, well, what about the other 48 that we don't even know where they are? Like, right, is that
this is a huge problem, and it's only come to light, I would say, in the last probably 7 years, and where it started to come to light was not researchers, but it was people within the detransition community in online social media blogs saying, wait a minute, all they're talking first person, as a detransitioner, and all the detransition people I know, we never go back to our original medical professional. They have no idea that we detransition. We're not showing up in the studies. That was starting to be said out loud in 2015, 16, 17. And it wasn't until 2020, 2021, when about 6 pretty good studies from researchers on detransition who did not show the kind of bias that I've seen in the past, said, we are probably, this is the statistic I'm seeing today, probably 75% of detransitioners never report to anybody that they detransition.
Now the study.
Okay, so that's the number I want to just grab is there. He's saying good studies are showing probably 75% of detransitioners don't show up in the studies on detransition. Let's just assume that's true. And let's assume that 0.5%, 1%, 2% detransition rate that we've said is in all the studies. Let's assume that it's the high number. Let's assume that's 2%. If we're short 75%, we're undercutting by 75%, then that 2 turns into 8.
Yep.
It ends up being roughly 8% detransition rate.
Yep.
Which still means we have a 92% satisfaction rate with gender transition.
Yep. Which is
still great. I think knee surgeries have a 15% regret rate.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you're still talking 92% of people are happy with this and not detransitioning.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why he likes the 75% number. He could have said those 2% numbers would really be up around 8% if you included those estimated loss participants. If he had said that, it would not have sounded the same way, though.
Right.
And again, and I want to be, I know I've done this like 7 times while we've been recording, but like, I want to be really clear. I am not saying that he is trying to intentionally misrepresent the situation.
Right.
I think his Jesus magic has failed. That's a good way to say it. But I just mean like he has a bias, and I think we are seeing it. And that does not mean that he saw it. There is a pressure working on him. He did this work on behalf of an institution that is paying him, and that institution and this interview are both pressuring him to explain away high satisfaction rates.
Right.
And like when you are in that situation, there's a lot of, again, preconscious pressure. You're not necessarily aware of it, right? Like there's this preconscious pressure to present your findings in a way that are most going to please your audience. Yes. And I think that's what we're seeing here. And again, that is not to accuse Dr. Eddy of being unethical. It's not to accuse him of intentionally misrepresenting data. I think the cardinal sin so far of this episode came right at the beginning when Preston praised Dr. Eddy of being magically immune from the kind of researcher bias that they are accusing and legitimately raising as a question for all studies. It's just that is a problem that we've known existed with research forever, and we have come up with structures to account for that.
Right. Yeah, every study has limitations. Any study that says it doesn't is a red flag, right?
I also found it troubling when he sort of said, like, this only came to light recently. I mean, I would need to go back and look at all the studies he's talking about, but I would expect to find in the methodology section of all of those papers discussion of lost study participants. Because you have to say, here's the population, here's where we got it from, here's what we ended up with, here's how we got our numbers, here's how we developed our numbers. You actually have to put that in your methodology section. So I suspect that what he means when he says it came to light is just people outside of academia started talking about it. Like, it became a thing that people were talking about, rather than it was something that was duly reported in the studies, and that anybody who wanted to use those to do follow-up work was aware of.
Now, the study in 1992, did you have that issue as well? Or because you said this is a really thorough study.
Thorough in the sense of longitudinal.
Okay.
But thorough because they didn't know about this problem.
Oh, so they might have, this is the 1 to 1.5.
I think for sure that study does not. But okay, first off, there were just fewer people who'd gone.
So he's talking about the study that he referenced earlier in the podcast about where that 1.5% detransition rate comes. Like, does that come from 1992 and whatever? And he's just asserting that, like, they didn't know in 1992 that people who stopped transitioning, detransition might not report, which seems suspect to me. So we'll keep going.
Transition at all back then. So we're listening in 92, they're probably working off data from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which was a much smaller number of people that had ever transitioned, like total. But I still suspect that there were some people they did lose. But in increasing, you see, the more people that transition, and certainly now the more the detransition is a known category with a community behind it that refuses to go back, and like, this is a snowball effect on how significant this problem is as we go forward. So
I didn't quite follow his snowball there. He seemed to kind of be saying, there are more transitioners, therefore there are more detransitioners.
Yeah,
and now we're aware that there's detransitioners, I guess.
Or like detransitioners are aware of each other, and then that's meant to be like encouraging other people who would. I know, I'm trying to imagine. It seems like he has this idea of like transitioned people that would want to detransition if only there were a community there for them. I'm skeptical of that idea, right? Like that it's a lack of a supportive detransitioner community that prevents people who have transitioned from detransition. I think, that seems very strange. It was also strange that he hit that line we were just talking about, the percentage of detransitioners who then later retransition, right? Because as we've talked about, there are a lot of reasons to detransition, and like, oops, I wasn't actually trans is a pretty low percentage of those folks.
Absolutely.
I suspect it affected those, but today, if this is not being accounted for, we are just wildly out of line with what's happening.
So if it's not being accounted for, but it is accounted, like, researchers are at least aware of it to the extent that they can be. So
happening on the ground today.
Oh, okay. So that 1 to 2%, there are other studies that came out after 1992?
So I would say the three big studies on the affirmative. So folks who are affirmative will quote 1 to 2% pretty frequently. Where do they get the 2%? In 2014, Detransition et al., there's a group of people in Europe, team in Europe, 2.2% regret. Right now, what's interesting is they defined regret as applying for legal detransition. So it wasn't just a regret stat, that was a detransition stat. Those two often get confused.
Yeah.
And then now the statistic you're going to see increasingly among affirmative folks today is actually.
So she came up with 2.2%. It was interesting that he like grabbed the whole regret and detransition are different. And I'm like, percent who legally changed, all right, that feels like a pretty good number for people who actually, like, if you legally transitioned and then legally detransitioned, right? That's like a pretty decent detransition number. It doesn't show regret, right? And many detransitioners don't actually regret transitioning to begin with. And some
And
who
this is-
transition probably regret transition, but don't detransition because that would be too hard. I guess maybe.
And this is the
but
thing, right? Like, I think what we see in this whole video is that it's sort of ironic that Eddy here is accusing, you know, he's like, well, really, you have to distinguish between, are we talking about regret? Are we talking about detransition? Fine, sure, those are legitimate distinctions to make,
Right.
for sure. And then when you're talking about detransition, what kind of detransition are you talking about? Medical or legal or social?
Right.
And those are all legitimate distinctions to make. And what's fascinating to me is how he and Sprinkle will go back and forth between being like hypercritical and distinct, and then they'll like conflate them all over the place and be like, well, this is a problem because high regret rate. This is actually a problem because high detransition rate. Right? Like, I don't think they're very consistent in their attempt to use the data they're sort of playing with here to sort of forward their own arguments.
Very, yeah.
Actually dropping 0.3 to 0.6.
Oh, wow.
You're going to start seeing that more and more, and here's the reason why. A 2018 study by Weepjes et al., it's another European group, found the stat that female to male regret rate 0.3, male to female 0.6, so below 1%. And I'm starting to see that study statistics being replicated now. Why? Well, they did find that, and it's a pretty longitudinal study. However, they note in this study, and this is another important limitation factor we've got to take into account with any study, they note that the average time span between transition and detransition, the average was 10.8 years.
Oh, wow.
Now, that means if you have studies that are assessing people short of 10 years, you're having a deflated rate of detransition because most people don't even get to it to that point. And when you start looking at and tracking longitudinal time spans, most of them run between 6 months since transition, like 6 months,
6 months.
up to 5 years.
Okay.
So this part really frustrates me.
Yeah. I was like, oh, I got thoughts.
Go for it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. No, it's so like what he's saying is, at least to me, again, speaking as a trans woman, right? Like, so counterintuitive, right? Like the idea that like after, sorry, but like 5 years into transition, you're still not clear, and you're like, I'm gonna keep this up for another 4 years, and then like, you know, somewhere around the 10-year mark, you're like, you know, I think actually I'm not trans. Like, that is ridiculous to me. I have no idea what kind of psychology he's basing his hypothesis on here. I mean, it's really fascinating. If they have a 10-year longitudinal study, like, that's great. I would say that like that probably captures every, like, if you make it 10 years, it seems very unlikely to me that you're ever going to detransition. Again, not impossible, but it just seems really unlikely unless you detransition for ideological reasons or religious reasons, right? But outside of that, I don't think you're detransitioning because you're like, actually, I think I'm not actually a woman. I was exploring those fields when HRT first started kicking in. I explored those fields before my first surgery. I explored those fields before I come out publicly and make my major social transition. Once all that's in place and it's been going for a while, like, I have a pretty good sense of what my life is like now and how I feel about my life now and how I'm showing up in the world and how I'm being perceived and in comparison to how I was before. Like, it's not going to take me 10 years to figure this out, right? Like, it just seems a very strange thing for him to be saying.
Right. I saw an interview with one detransitioner who detransitioned after like 13, 14 years. She doesn't regret having transitioned. She is staunchly against what we would call like political detransitioners, detransitioners who then not only say, I want to be able to detransition and I want access to healthcare to be able to do that, but I want to actually stop anybody else from transitioning, right? Not only was this wrong for me, it's actually wrong for everybody. And so, you know, Chloe Cole is probably the most famous one, but Aaron Reed, a trans journalist, brings it up a lot. If there are so many detransitioners who are so upset that their transition and felt like they were wronged, where are they, right? Like, why is it that these court cases, you consistently have the same group always? Florida actually had their court case about gender affirming care for minors, and the judge was actually like, in striking down the gender affirming care ban in Florida for minors, he actually was like, the state is saying we need to protect these minors because they're going to regret their decision. And yet the state in all of Florida has failed to find one such case to bring to the court.
Yeah.
Like, they don't have one. If there isn't even one, what are we even talking about? It's just this always, I've heard people talk about like, the detransitioners are always out of frame, right? That it's like,
Yeah.
oh, trust us, if you just move the camera a little bit, you'll find, if you just look at people who've been transitioned for 10 years or longer, then you'll find them.
Like, they've been predicting this, like, we're going to get a giant tidal wave of detransitioners since the Littman study, right? So 6 years, right? So they've been saying like, we think this is a thing, and therefore we are predicting that we are going to see X because of our hypothesis. That'll like justify our hypothesis.
Right.
And we keep not seeing it, and they just keep predicting it and kicking the can down the road. Like, it's pretty ridiculous. Right. 6 years after saying like there's all these not really trans people being infected with the trans mind virus, and they're all like thinking they need to transition, but they're all going to detransition soon. 6 years later, if they haven't yet, I'm just saying like we should be pretty skeptical about what Eddy's saying here.
Yeah, they start to sound like rapture predictors who are like, well, it's going to be on this date. This is definitely what is happening, right? That's when Jesus is going back, right? And then it comes and it doesn't happen. And they predict another date, and then that date comes, and it doesn't happen, and they're like, oh, wait, no, sorry, right? And it's just like, at no point do they ever just say, maybe we were wrong.
Right? Like, the data is not supporting our hypothesis, therefore maybe we were wrong about it. I've seen like trans like activist type people and just online folks sort of challenge them on this one and be like, okay, make a prediction then. Like, give me, like, do the rapture thing, right? Like, so how many should we expect? You can lowball it. Just how many should we expect by what date? Let me know when I can come back. I'm going to save the tweet, right? Like, let me know when I can come back and challenge you on like what's going on with this. Yeah. And they don't like giving it. Like, I think there's a kind of background awareness that like people that transition are usually pretty happy with that choice.
Exactly. Like, and then the other part that I don't like about this is they are right that there have been, I would guess that most people who have transitioned in the last 10 years. A lot of that's because healthcare became available, like health insurance started covering transition. You got better, more accepting laws. You got DSM-5, which depathologized it and introduced the gender dysphoria diagnosis instead of the gender identity disorder. You're counting 3. What else you got?
You got the shifting and broadening understanding of transness, and so you got a lot of people who are eggs being like, oh shit, that's me, like that explains my experience, right? So like as like just greater awareness leads to a greater number of people like finding the language to put to their experience,
right? And that was absolutely the case for me once I discovered that there were particularly Christian trans people. I was like, you can do that? But the thing I really don't like that I wanted to say about this is I've been transitioning for, we'll call it 2 years. You've been transitioning a little bit longer than that. According to Dr. Eddy and Dr. Sprinkle here, neither of us counts. The fact that I am thrilled with my transition and happy beyond anything that I imagined I could be, and I'm kind of angry that I didn't get to transition long ago because it's amazing and it's the best thing ever, right? It'd be like, well, you have to wait 8 more years at least, because that's just the medium. Really, we got to wait, probably, I'm sure we got to wait, 15, 20 years, right? Really to make sure.
They can keep pushing that down the road, right? Like,
right. When really his number is like, it's 0.3 to 0.6%. And he's saying, well, most of the people in that study were less than 10 years, but the median was 10 years. And so, whatever, which I'm like, okay, theoretically, the people who did that study have the data to be, okay, amongst people who made it to 10 years, what percent detransition? They have that data, right? Send them a question and say, hey, what, can you share that data? It seems like a worthy follow-up. Like, this is a question that has an answer. But again, Dr. Eddy, what you're saying here, you have a hypothesis that this number will go up when you account for people who have only been transitioned 10 years or more. Go test it. This should be a thing that's easy to test. But it bothers me that it essentially, it's not the last time in this podcast that they will do things to invalidate people and data who are inconvenient for them.
This is like the thing to keep watching for if you're watching along with us, right? Is just how frequently the whole presentation is about, yes, actually the data that we have does say X,
Right.
but here's why we don't trust it. And therefore, kind of half unspoken, we believe Y, where there's no data to support Y.
Right.
But this is kind of the game they're playing for like the entire episode.
Yeah, but we have a question about the data.
Mhm.
Okay, then go get more data.
Yep. And don't assert the opposite. They really are treating like Sprinkle's anecdotal experiential evidence as like on par with these like studies that even if all their critiques are legitimate of every single one of these studies, that does not bring them down to the level of like Sprinkle's life experience.
Right.
Right. But they're treating them as though that they are of like equal weight, and it's kind of insane.
10 years when the average person actually realizes. So we are not only follow-up problem, we are missing the longitudinal length necessary to catch when most people eventually detransition.
Do we have any studies that are longitudinal?
Yes, we do.
Past 10 years.
What
do they show?
Very few. Okay. And the weakest one was longer. Now, why did they get such low rates on that? Because they were stuck with the 1960s data, 60s, 70s, 80s. Remember, again, in those early years, because of the rigorous processes, fewer and fewer people who did all, and fewer people who detransitioned because of the rigorous assessments they had to go through to be able to do that. So all of that data
I'm going to throw the flag there on he just confidently says fewer detransitioners back then than now. He has no data to back that up. And he not only says that the rate of detransitioner is higher now than it was, he actually confidently asserts the cause of it being we had more gatekeeping back then than we have now. Yep. Right? So not only is he asserting a thing that he doesn't have any data to back up, but he's asserting the cause behind it, which just seems incredibly sloppy.
And can we back out for a second and like notice what's happened? Like the numbers are striking me really here, right? Like because in his studies that don't have the 10-year window on them, right? There, the numbers we're looking at are like 1.5 to 2%, right? For detransition, right? Then you extend to that 10-year window. And now you're getting numbers between 0.3 and 0.6%, right? So it's actually going down when you go with like that longer window. And so it seems like even if he is right, like, so even if we grant his argument here that like, okay, we've decreased gatekeeping. So what was the percentage harm in decreasing gatekeeping, right? It was a shift from 0.6% all the way up to 2%. Right. Like it's this little micro fraction increase, right? Like we got, and I can say that like studying the history of transits that like the shift from the kind of gatekeeping that was happening in the 60s and 70s where somebody like me, somebody like you would not have been allowed to transition, right? Because of not being straight, right? Like because I am attracted to women, I would not have been allowed to transition unless I lied to my therapist about my attractions. They were gatekeeping trans lesbians out. They were also gatekeeping gay trans men out of like access to transition care. So like that's the kind of gatekeeping that was going on. So when they get rid of the gatekeeping, right, if you are a trans skeptical person, you would expect that like this would lead to this giant wave of like confused, ungate-kept people who are transitioning. The numbers by their account go up by about 1%. Any ethical analysis of like gatekeeping versus not gatekeeping when you only see a rise in total population of regret from like 0.3 to like 1.5, that is like that's going to argue in favor of no gatekeeping, right? He doesn't seem to know it, but I think he's actually making the argument for getting rid of gatekeeping for the informed consent model.
Even if you say that the number of people transitioning is up 50x, you're saying, wow, we've gone up, we've allowed 50 times more people to transition at a cost of only, we've dropped our satisfaction rate from 99 to 98.
Right, exactly.
That's like, pretty good.
Right? Absolutely. If you have that kind of it fails to work, it fails to accomplish a thing, it has some negative side effects at a 1%, you do the thing. Right? Like given what they are alleviating, right, every like medical ethicist is going to say like, oh no, you do that thing. Like you absolutely, that is within the acceptable range of like regret in order to like full-throatedly endorse this. It's just like cis people are weirded out by us. To them, the horror of a person who is not actually transitioning is
Right.
so extreme that like one person for them seems to be enough to justify not letting any of us transition. Also, can I just say the idea that like, yep, it was real easy to be trans in the 80s and 90s is so ridiculous, right? Like, it's like the 80s and 90s is a great time to be a trans person in the United States.
What? Ace Ventura came out in 94, right?
Something like that, yeah.
When was Silence of the Lambs?
Silence of the Lambs. It was like, what, early 90s, I think, as well.
Right?
Oh
Like,
my gosh.
there was not a lot of good representation and some pretty horrible representation, really bad
Queer
representation, trans people, queer bashing across the board. And so that was the factor that you mentioned, like more visibility, but also just more acceptance, right?
Yeah.
Is like, there are more people today who are like, yeah, trans people are perfectly valid people. They're just trans. Like, what's the big deal? But there's a lot more acceptance and appreciation for it, and a lot more understanding of what gender dysphoria is, what people do to alleviate it. So that acceptance that we've had today also drives a lot more people being able to come out of the closet and say, yeah, this is me. This is who I am.
Into the Weeps's analysis. And I think we have to remember that shift is something that we can't apply 60s, 70s, 80s data to the context today. And yet it is done in longitudinal studies that go back that far.
So if there,
I don't understand that point. Like, he just got finished quoting a bunch of current studies and then saying, well, there's an older study, but we shouldn't only use that older study. But we also don't like the current studies. It's just this, I think in the last call, I used the phrase like epistemological sabotage. No matter what study they do, they come up with one thing that they're like, I don't like this about this study. And so this study doesn't count. And then move on. Well, here's a study that accounts for that. Oh, well, it has this other thing wrong. Oh, well, but the previous study had that. Oh, but you have to have both at the same time. Well, here's a study that has both at the same time. Yeah, but it doesn't have a third thing. Right.
At this point, they're asking for like a longitudinal study that's with a greater than 10-year horizon that started no earlier than 2016.
Right.
This is 2024, man. Like,
right. Which they're going to get to. And they're going to say eventually, that's why you just can't know right now. That is their end game here.
That's it for this episode. We've still got a lot to cover, so come back next time. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to my friend Billie for joining. You'll find Billie's socials and my own, as well as related resources, in the show notes. Thank you for listening.